opening remarks, and then I'll turn the program over to Professor Caroline Evans in our history department, and she'll be introducing our speaker. We are about to conclude our 3-year commemoration of the 250th anniversary of Hampden-Sydney's founding. The theme of our anniversary celebration has been civic virtue. Justice John Charles Thomas opened the commemoration during our 2023 opening convocation with his remarks, "The skills of freedom, the profound importance of the liberal arts." We then welcomed Christy Coleman of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, who spoke on the importance of remembering. And we've since hosted distinguished historians, including Alan Taylor, John Regasta, and Jeffrey Rosen, and soon our commencement speaker, Alan Pelzo. Our own faculty members have contributed their expertise and perspective on panels and at our anniversary symposium last fall. We've also been honored to host some of our government leaders, alumni, including former Congressman Robert Hurt and former House Delegate Chris Peace delivered opening convocation remarks. And then Governor Glenn Youngkin delivered the address at our Founders Day convocation last fall. Tonight, we're honored to host Senator Tim Kaine. For 250 years, Hampden-Sydney has embraced its profoundly important mission to form good men and good citizens. And one of the most vital ways our students can fulfill that mission is to serve in public office. I'm sure public service can be thankless work, but it is also essential to the survival and success of our republic. So we are grateful to you, Senator Kaine, for your service and that you agreed to be here tonight to deliver tonight's Heinemann lecture. Caroline Evans, as I mentioned, will offer a fuller introduction of Senator Kaine, so I will close my welcome with a few remarks about Professor Ron Heinemann. Though Ron and his wife Sandy had retired before I arrived at Hampden-Sydney, they remained active in the community, and Ron was still teaching on an occasional basis. They warmly welcomed my family and me, and I quickly came to learn that Ron had strong convictions and an incredible devotion to Hampden-Sydney, which he had made the focus of his life's work. In speaking with our alumni, I often ask who or what had the biggest impact on him during his time here. The most common response is Ron Heinemann. They frequently say, "No one made me think more." Many of you have heard me say that people make the place. Impactful teachers like Ron Heinemann make Hampden-Sydney the exceptional place of learning that it is. And it is that legacy of impactful teaching that we honor each year through the Ron Heinemann Lecture. And as I said, I'm now pleased to welcome Caroline Evans, who will introduce our guest.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Ronald L. Heinemann Lecture on the History of the American South. And we are very pleased to bring you a special 250th anniversary edition with Senator Tim Kaine as our speaker. Professor Heinemann taught at Hampden-Sydney from 1968 to 2020, and during that long tenure, as President Stember just said, he achieved iconic status as a beloved history professor who challenged and inspired legions of students. Those of you who knew Professor Heinemann can attest that he loved nothing more, he truly loved nothing more than a good debate about the interpretation of history as well as its meaning in our current society. After his passing in 2020, the history department decided that the best way we could honor him is to continue a tradition that he loved at the college, lectures such as this, in which we are encouraged to reflect deeply on historical legacies that continue to have an impact on our society today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank the Department of History, the 250th Planning Committee, and all of the administrative offices that provided support for this event. I believe Ron would be especially excited about our speaker tonight. Senator Kaine is known to many of us for his long years of public service in a variety of roles, which I will describe to you in a moment. Senator Kaine is also undertaking historical research in all of his spare time on an important court case from the 17th century that had profound implications for the development of slavery. If he does not mention that project in his remarks, I hope someone will ask him about it during the Q&A. This brought him into contact with my colleague John Coombs, and ever since, John and I have discussed Senator Kaine to campus to talk about his work on Virginia history, among other topics. And I especially want to acknowledge John's work in organizing our program tonight. Hampden-Sydney was founded on a mission to prepare good men and good citizens who would not only benefit from the privileges of citizenship, but would fulfill their responsibilities as citizens as well. Senator Kaine provides us with an outstanding example of public service. He was elected to the United States Senate in 2012, and he is currently a member of the Armed Services, the Budget, the Foreign Relations, and the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committees. His public service career began by running a technical school founded by Jesuits in Honduras. After receiving his law degree from Harvard Law School, he served as a civil rights attorney in Richmond before first being elected to office in 1994 as a city councilman in Richmond and then as mayor. In 2002, he was elected lieutenant governor, and he was inaugurated as Virginia's 70th governor in 2006. As President Stewart said, we're entering the final month of our 3-year-long commemoration of Hampden-Sydney's 250th anniversary. This has been a chance for us to reflect on the college's historic founding and the continuing relevance of its mission, as well as our anniversary theme of civic virtue. And to help us continue that reflection, it is my very great honor to introduce you to Senator Tim Kaine.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. This is an honor. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please. Thank you. What a tremendous honor to be here. I can't tell you how excited I am about this opportunity, and the fact that my chance interaction with John a number of years ago has led me to be able to share in this momentous anniversary with you. To Caroline for your kind words, Larry for your wonderful stewardship of Hampden-Sydney, this tremendous institution. Before my remarks, just ponder this: what were the Las Vegas odds in 1775 that Hampden-Sydney would be here today? There weren't even Las Vegas odds in 1775. But if there had been, I mean, just think about it. The map of the world has completely changed. Languages that were spoken no longer are. We travel differently. We eat different things. We communicate differently. Virtually everything about life has changed since 1775. But there are points of continuity. And those points of continuity that have existed for the 250 years have existed not by accident. They've existed by hard work, but they've also existed because they're rooted in values that are very important. So it is truly an honor to be with you tonight. I'm honored to present this lecture in celebration of Professor Heinemann, who I did not know, but it was really interesting when it was reported that I was going to be with you tonight. I started to get outreach from many Hampden-Sydney alums who told me their Heinemann stories. Clearly someone who made a huge impact. And one of my friends, Dale Pittman, who some of you might know, who's a lawyer in Petersburg, talked about the fact that Ron Heinemann had such a huge impact on his life that when his own daughter went to college, I believe at Georgetown, and she came home at Thanksgiving, she said to him, "Dad, I have found my Heinemann." And when he shared that story with the then retired Professor Heinemann, it was a very emotional one. So what a wonderful opportunity to deliver comments in his honor. I'm daunted by the challenge of offering some thoughts worthy of his example as a prodigious scholar, but I'm also excited to share some thoughts, but then especially engage in spirited questions and answers with you. I've had 2 sessions of Q&A already, and I know Hampden-Sydney students are pretty good at the questions. I'm not a historian, but I have given my life humbly to try to shape events in my era. I practiced law in Richmond for 17 years, trying civil rights cases all over Virginia, and I'm one of just 30 people in the history of the United States who has been a mayor, governor, and senator. Just 30. I was introduced that way once. I didn't know that was the fact, and I said, that can't be right. So many governors serve as senators. So I went to the Senate historian. I said, Kate, I've been introduced as one of 30 people in American history to be a mayor, governor, and senator. Be right. She said, I'll research it. A week later, she came back and said, that is right. And then I realized why. Being mayor will kill you. Governor, senator, there's a lot of them, but being mayor is extremely tough. I'm struck, obviously, by the twin 250th anniversaries, with Hampden-Sydney completing your 3-year commemoration of your 250th in 1775. And our Commonwealth and country embarked upon the same period of reflection to kind of land at the critical day of July 4, celebrating 250 years of democracy, 250 years of this institution. You've got to step back at moments like this and reflect and then recommit to the values that have carried you thus far. And as I've said, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for values. A 250th anniversary of a school dedicated to forming good men and good citizens, or of a nation that's been a beacon of hope, of democracy for the world, is almost too big a topic to confront. So I'm going to grapple with the big topic by being very specific about one event, a momentous and enduring event that occurred in Williamsburg on July 5th, 1776. Of course, we all know it happened on July 4, 1776. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in the midst of a war for independence that had begun 15 months previously, unanimously adopted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was the principal drafter for a pretty impressive committee of 5 that also included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. The Virginia delegates who were there, who voted to ratify the Declaration, were Jefferson, Carter Braxton, Benjamin Harrison V, Francis Lightfoot Lee, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Nelson Jr., and the scholar and law professor who taught Thomas Jefferson law, George Wythe. Voting to ratify the Declaration and affixing your signature to it was basically signing your own death sentence, because it was a public declaration of treason against the British Crown. So think about, Delegate Peace and I cast a lot of votes. We signed our names to a lot of things, but thinking about casting a vote that was essentially a declaration of treason. So that's what happened on July 4th. What about July 5th? As the Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, an important group of Virginians, I guess they were kind of like the JV, but a pretty good group, they were meeting in Williamsburg, the 5th Virginia Convention. Virginia had declared its independence in May. And so this group of Virginians who weren't in Philadelphia, they met in Williamsburg to adopt the governing structure for this brand new Commonwealth, emerging from centuries of English rule. The convention took 4 momentous actions within a very short time, and of the 4, one endures to this day. The first action, really important, the adoption of the Virginia Declaration of Rights on June 12. It was drafted by George Mason, and its proclamation of inherent rights for mankind influenced many later documents, most especially the United States Bill of Rights. Virginia's current Bill of Rights grew from that original action, but the current version has been subject to frequent revision. While some snippets of the original remain in the current version looks much, much different than that adopted in 1776. The second action was the adoption of the first Virginia Constitution on June 29. This was obviously a critical step in directing the path of our beloved Virginia, but it's been rewritten 5 times, in 1830, 1851, 1864, 1870, 1902, and 1971. The current 1971 version has also been revised periodically via a referendum process. It may well be revised further this November. 3 referenda, one dealing with marriage equality, one with restoration of felon rights, one with reproductive choice, will be put before the public so it could see an additional revision. So the Constitution of 1776, while influential, it has not endured. The third action was the election of Virginia's first governor, also on June 29, Patrick Henry, an early board member of this institution, was the most popular political figure in Virginia after having delivered the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in Richmond in March 1775. His election as our first governor lent his own prestige to the other actions taken by the Fifth Convention, guaranteeing the popular acceptance of those actions. He is still rightly revered, but like all governors, his tenure was finite. He actually served twice as both the first and the sixth governors of Virginia. But there have been many, many since him. Abigail Spanberger, our current governor, is governor number 75. So what was the enduring action? Now we come to July 5 and the convention's action that is both momentous and enduring. On the 1st of July, a 4-person committee was impaneled. George Wythe, George Mason, Henry Lee, and Robert Carter Nicholas, with the task of developing a state seal. The state seal was really critical at this time because you didn't know whether a document was an official document of Virginia unless the state seal was affixed to it. And so the crafting of a state seal was not only about the identity of the state, but it was the proof that a document was official. The committee, 4 of them, squirreled away in the William and Mary Library, which was heavily affected by the donation of George Wythe of his own books to that library, later being donated to Thomas Jefferson and later becoming the first books that formed the collection of the Library of Congress. This committee took 4 days, and they presented to the convention on July 5th something that was unanimously approved: the Virginia State Seal. You've all seen this throughout your life. This was the decision that endured. It's displayed on a blue background as the Virginia state flag. A version of the flag was first adopted in the 1830s and then eventually adopted by the General Assembly in 1861. Sometimes we get so used to something that we walk by it repeatedly without thinking about it. This is in so many of the rooms where we do business. This very flag, the blue background with the Virginia State Seal, adopted July 5, 1775. George Wythe was the key designer of the seal. Wythe was fascinated with ancient Roman and Greek art. He had a book about Roman and Greek art that had been authored by an English pastor named Joseph Spence with all kinds of examples. As you might imagine, the committee, in thinking about the state seal, wanted nothing to do with anything English. Nothing to do with anything English. And so they decided to go back to Roman ideas for developing the state seal. The design pulled heavily from the book that Wythe had from Pastor Spence, and I'm going to read you the legislative language adopted then that is still in place describing the state seal. The Great Seal of the Commonwealth shall consist of two metallic discs, 2 1/4 inches in diameter, with an ornamental border 1/4 of an inch wide, with such words and figures engraved as follows. On the obverse, that means front, Virtus, the genius of the Commonwealth, dressed as an Amazon, resting a spear in her right hand, pointed downward, touching the earth, and holding in her left hand a sheathed sword, or perizonium, pointed upward. Her head erect and face upturned, her left foot on the form of Tyranny, represented by the prostrate body of a man with his head to her left, his fallen crown nearby, a broken chain in his left hand and a scourge in his right. Above the group and within the border conforming therewith, thou shalt be the word Virginia, and in the space below on a curved line, the motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Now, if you followed thus far, you may have wondered, was George Wythe a time traveler to be in Philadelphia on July 4 with the Declaration of Independence and then Williamsburg on July 5? No. George Wythe was so focused on Virginia that he actually left Philadelphia before the final vote, having made it plain that he was a supporter of the Declaration of Independence. When the Virginians signed the Declaration, he left to go to Williamsburg to work on the state seal. They left the first signature blank from the Virginians because they so valued him, they thought he should be the first signature. And he came back 2 months later, after July 4th, to put his signature on the document. The original declaration has the George Wythe. He wasn't a time traveler, but he valued the Virginia task even more than being in Philadelphia for the signature of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, get this. The legislative enactment went on to describe the reverse side of the state seal. I bet you've never seen this. I had neither before I wrote this speech. Hey, raise your hand if you have seen this before. Okay, I've got a healthy 7 or 8. That's the reverse side of the Virginia. Well, let's see. I mean, is it here? Wait. Okay, well, let's look. No, that is the reverse of the front side. That is not the reverse side. Thomas Jefferson loved the state seal. He hated the reverse side. Here's what he said about it. This design is too enigmatical, whatever that means, since if it puzzles now, it will be absolutely insoluble 50 years hence. And you will likely never see it again. The Virginia seal and flag are very unusual. Only 6 state flags contain a woman. No other contains a monarch, dethroned or otherwise. Many states have made major changes to their state flags over the years. Just since 2000, Utah, Georgia, Mississippi, and Minnesota have made major redesigns of their state flags. But Virginia has been quite constant in sticking with its original design. There have been minor changes to the shade of blue, the size of the seal on the blue background, the comportment of the characters, the colors of their clothing, but the essential design has stayed the same. The last meaningful change was in 1901. Various versions of the Virginia flag before 1901 had interpreted the phrase "dressed as an Amazon" to depict the female virtus as bare-breasted, or with a single breast exposed, or with a full armored breastplate. There was no standard way to portray the female figure of virtue. This is not such a good slide, but you can see this was commonly used with the full armored breastplate, likely put on for reasons of modesty. Secretary of the Commonwealth, D.Q. Eggleston, believed that the version common in 1901 with the full armored breastplate that I'm showing you looked too much like a man. So he ordered a revision to depict virtus with one breast exposed, closely approximating the Amazon woman contained in the Spence book that George Wythe used to craft the Virginia seal. And the Virginia flag has featured toplessness ever since. Unique among all state flags. Now, I got to ask this question. Was Eggleston, or George Wythe for that matter, prescient enough to see that an innovative American company seeking a headquarters state would be drawn to the only state in America featuring an Amazon on its flag? That probably helped us land Amazon HQ2 in Arlington a couple years ago. The partially topless Amazon on our flag has not been without controversy. Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, when he was Attorney General, created official pins for his office, restoring the full breastplate that I showed you before, out of reasons of modesty. That move attracted national attention, and not the good kind. And just last year, get this, just last year, 2025, the Lamar Consolidated Independent School District in suburban Houston removed a section about Virginia from its online learning platform because the seal violated its, quote, frontal nudity policy. I remember coming into the Senate in 2013, we had small temporary offices. My office was next door to Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, who had come in at the same time. We each had our state flags prominently displayed outside our office. New Mexico has a beautiful state flag. If you've seen it, it's a golden background and a red sun design from the Zuni Pueblo. It's a very distinctive flag. I always admired it as I walked by. One day, I walked out of my office, and Martin was standing there staring at this with a puzzled look on his face. And he said to me, "What's this all about?" And all I could think was to say, "We got a crazy way of loving here." But, let me tell you this. As unusual as the topless flag is, the topless Amazon, the most striking feature of the flag is our motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis. All states have mottos. Some have multiple mottos. The mottos are mostly in English, some in Latin, like Virginia's. One is in Greek. Washington and Hawaii have mottos in indigenous languages. Minnesota's motto is in French. One state has a motto in Italian. Guess what state? You would think New York. Anybody got another guess? Massachusetts, that's a good guess. Maryland. I don't know why that is the case. Maryland is the only state with a motto in Italian. 49 states have mottos that are positive affirmations. Hope, onward, excelsior, eureka, to the stars through adversity, united we stand, divided we fall. You get the idea. Only one state has a motto that isn't a positive one. On the theory of positive mottos, the Michigan motto is the most randomly positive. It's Latin, but I'll translate for you. If you seek a pleasant peninsula, look about you. I wasn't exactly looking for a peninsula, but I'd rather it be pleasant than unpleasant. I mean, talking about random. Only one state departs from the positive motto tradition, Virginia. Our motto is a rebuke. It's a warning. Thus be it always to tyrants. This was a bold choice in 1776. The phrase Sic Semper Tyrannis has got some debate about where it came from. Pretty much all agree that George Wythe came up with it, and it was likely chosen by Wythe to echo words reported by Plutarch that had been spoken after the assassination of the Roman tribune Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BC, when he tried to unlawfully extend his term of office to ensure the success of his land reform initiatives. That's likely where Wythe got it, based upon the scholarship about how that phrase came to be. But it was a bold choice for the same reason that signing your name to the Declaration was a bold choice. Virginia supported independence, but many Virginians completely supported the monarchy. Other Virginians weren't wild about George III, but they weren't against monarchy per se. Finally, the Revolutionary War was just beginning, and the odds were very well stacked against American colonists defeating the most powerful nation on earth, and yet this was the choice. Note the verb tense of the phrase, not in the present tense. No tyrants or down with tyrants. The rebuke looks to the future, semper, ever, always. Thus be it ever, thus be it always to tyrants. The deposed tyrant, robed in the purple of imperial Rome, defeated by a virtuous woman with the motto proclaiming tyranny and its downfall as a perpetual future truth. Within his committee, by focusing on the future, we're warning that tyranny was a reality that we must always guard against. An article published just last year in the Saturday Evening Post purported to rank all 50 state mottos. Virginia ranked 46th. Here's what the Saturday Evening Post said about Virginia and Sic Semper Tyrannis. Yes, this motto was adopted in the 1700s, and yes, it's about defeating despots, but when your state housed the capital of the Confederacy, and your motto is the thing that John Wilkes Booth shouted after shooting Abraham Lincoln, it might not be a good look anymore. Now, the writer obviously assumes that the motto is a dusty relic, even a shameful one. While correct about Booth, he omits other history. For example, the 22nd U.S. Colored Infantry in the Civil War also chose Sic Semper Tyrannis as a banner to march under during their fight to eliminate slavery. This group of free black soldiers, primarily from New Jersey, fought bravely against tyranny in Petersburg and Richmond, and even participated in the solemn events surrounding President Lincoln's funeral procession. All right, back to the seal. If the Saturday Evening Post was right, and tyranny is a relic of the past, our motto's low ranking makes sense. But if George Wythe was right, and tyranny is an ever-present danger, the Virginia motto is wise and necessary. And I side with Wythe. The spirit of tyranny is not eradicated from our globe or from our nation. I lived in a military dictatorship, Honduras, when I was a missionary in 1980 and 81. And I learned that the democracy that I had previously taken for granted can never be simply assumed. Different forms of tyrants rule nations all around this globe. Some styled as governments of the right, some as governments of the left. Some style as governments mandated or ordained by religious doctrine, some styled as governments by military rulers, and some styled as family dynasties or personality cults. The war in Ukraine was initiated by a tyrant choosing to invade a neighboring democracy whose success would likely lead to increasing agitation and envy among his own oppressed population. At home, we see attacks on the press, on the concept of an independent judiciary and rule of law, on the constitutional framework of co-equal branches of government. We see the use of violence in attempt to overturn election results, the demonization of political opponents, and efforts to erase our shared history. We're engaged in a war declared by a president without congressional authorization, the authorization that the Constitution clearly requires. The war brings to mind very prescient words that were offered by Abraham Lincoln when he was a member of the House of Representatives, talking about our Constitution. The provision of the Constitution giving the war-making power to Congress was dictated, as I understand it, by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. This, our convention understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. Are these current trends just normal political differences maybe pushed to an extreme, or are they the very dangers that Wythe and his committee were warning us about? Plato wrote about tyranny 2,500 years ago. He wrote about different kinds of government, and he noted that tyrants usually emerge out of democracies, and they arise in a distinct fashion, according to Plato. This and no other is the root from which a tyrant springs. When he first appears, he is a protector. Hampden-Sydney itself, formed at the start of the Revolutionary War, expressed its firm opposition to tyranny in choosing as its namesake English parliamentarians John Hampden and Algernon Sidney. A century before the college's founding, these two individuals who never set foot in the United States became martyrs for representative democracy, with Hampden killed while fighting for the parliamentarians against the Royalists in the First English Civil War, and Sidney beheaded by order of King Charles II for writings about the rights of individuals to resist tyrannical rule. Sidney's discourses concerning government, together with the writings of John Locke, were among the most influential of texts in influencing America's founders. Of course, the American founders grappled deeply with this question of tyranny. The early experiences following America's success in the Revolutionary War were disappointing because the collection of states with a weak federal government was not sufficient for the management of this growing and dynamic country and population. And so they gathered in Philadelphia once again, with George Washington presiding to give them an example of selflessness and civic virtue, to replace the feeble Articles of Confederation with the newly drawn Constitution. Get this, who was there? George Wythe. I don't know that there was anyone else who was in Philadelphia for the Declaration of Independence, in Williamsburg for the Virginia Convention, and then back in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Wythe is one of our founders who doesn't get the attention that he deserves. But anyway, with these worries about tyranny, so much of the Constitution, and I know this is a subject of deep study here at Hampden-Sydney, virtually everybody, So much of the Constitution, the division of power between... All right, is that my Alexa? Or, yeah. So much of the Constitution, the division of power between federal and state governments, the division of federal power into three branches, executive, legislative, judiciary, the division of legislative power into two bicameral houses, the careful allocation of war powers not to the executive but to the legislative branch. All of these efforts were the attempt to provide a safeguard against tyranny. The Bill of Rights, authored principally by James Madison, another early board member of this institution, is a document designed to protect individuals against the tyranny of government, against the tyranny of established religion, against the tyranny even of a popular majority. The framers of the Constitution, as we know, they got many things wrong. The three clauses regarding slavery may have seemed necessary compromises at the time, but they had to be excised from the document by the Civil War and the passage of the three post-Civil War amendments to create a nation more faithful to the equality promise that animated the Declaration of Independence. But they got so many things right. So many things right. And their worry about tyranny as an ever-present danger was timeless. They saw the danger in exactly the same way George Wythe did. Let's step back to the seal for a minute. The figures don't represent democracy ascendant over monarchy. That's not what they represent. Those would be systems of government. The description that Wythe authored made plain they represent virtue ascendant over tyranny. Those are traits of human nature. This is not a flag about systems of government. It's really a flag about human nature and a prediction that virtue, which lives in our hearts, will overcome tyranny, which lives in our hearts. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Nobel laureate from the Soviet Union, has a line, "The line between good and evil runs through the heart of every person." This is fundamentally a flag about human nature as much as it is about government. It's interesting that Wythe specified that the figure of virtus would be a woman. So I'm not a Latin scholar, but I understand that virtue from virtus is a root that originally signified manliness. Manliness. And it's evolved into more generally connoting moral courage or goodness, that a committee of 4 men and a convention composed completely of men specified that the victorious virtue warrior would be a woman is important to note. And it raises a good question. I've spent a good bit of the last few minutes talking about tyranny. What about virtue? What about virtue? What type of virtue did Wythe and the others of his generation believe would be needed to overcome tyranny? The theme of Hampden-Sydney's 250th anniversary has been the concept of civic virtue. And you've invited much discussion, Mr. President. You talked about the speakers you've had in the symposium that you offered in October to really dig into this phrase, civic virtue. Talking about civic virtue, and I've already done the speech about tyranny, would be a separate speech, but let me just offer 2 thoughts about virtue. First, personal virtue, honesty, courage, integrity is important and it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Personal virtue is not the same as civic virtue. Civic virtue is something more. It's about taking traits of personal virtue into the arena of public life and being an active participant. What is it to be an active participant? Is it just voting? Madison was tasked with drafting the Bill of Rights. And I imagine most of you know this story. Madison was originally an opponent of the idea that a Bill of Rights was needed in the Constitution. He reasoned that most states, including Virginia, were already doing Bills of Rights. He was nervous that drafting a national Bill of Rights would almost certainly omit something that we would regret later, and so why even try? But Madison today would be called a flip-flopper, and thank God he was. Even though he opposed originally the idea of a Bill of Rights, he came to believe it was necessary for 2 reasons. First, the Constitution needed to be ratified. 9 of the 13 states had to vote for its ratification, and many states really demanded that there be a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and they would not have ratified without it, Massachusetts being one of those states. So Madison was a good vote counter. But Madison changed his mind for another reason. He saw Baptist ministers being persecuted in Virginia, a state that was still heavily dominated by the Church of England. And he came to realize that, okay, we have a protection about this in Virginia, but it's apparently not strong enough. And so maybe we need this national protection of people's ability to worship or not as they please. The Bill of Rights contains legal protections for individuals, but I'd also argue, as my second point about virtue, that it contains a working definition of civic virtue. And that definition is Madison's powerhouse First Amendment. If you think about the Constitution, there are provisions that we don't use that much. The Third Amendment, you shall not be forced to quarter troops in your house. Doesn't come up that often. But if you think about powerhouses, the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment, I think, are the two powerhouses. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, freedom to petition. The Supreme Court has also read into the clause the freedom to associate. We're exercising three of these freedoms right now: speech, association, and assembly. If any press is present, there's a fourth freedom. And if anyone in the Q&A asks me to do anything, you're petitioning government for redress of grievances. There's a fifth freedom. This is a powerhouse. It's interesting to note that while the Constitution supposes popular voting in its provisions about the process for electing representatives and electing a president, the original Bill of Rights did not include voting rights protections. Did not include voting rights protections. It took the post-Civil War 14th and 15th Amendments to correct that omission and add voting protections into the Bill of Rights. So the framers believed in voting, obviously, but they did not believe that it was so powerful that it needed to be put in the First Amendment. They did not believe that voting was sufficient to protect a democracy. A more vigorous participation in the ways laid out right here was what they had in mind. Think of this text, we think of it as a protection, a prohibition against Congress doing certain things, and a protection of individuals. Think of it not just as a protection, but as an encouragement. Think of it as an encouragement. Personal virtue can be possessed, but civic virtue has to be practiced. Mark Twain satirized our wavering attachment to these crucial freedoms in an 1897 book that he wrote called Following the Equator. It's a travelogue of journals around the world, and he writes some in the first person, but he also writes some using some of his famous characters from earlier works like Pudd'nhead Wilson. And here's what he said about our wavering attachment to these freedoms. It is by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence to never practice either. He was making fun of our tendency to conformity. The massive No Kings rallies across the country a few days ago suggest that Twain might have gotten us wrong. There was a rally earlier today on campus about the redistricting referendum that was a use of this in practice to advocate positions and discuss issues of importance. I don't think Twain got us right. I think these are critical protections that we rely on every day. So now, as you walk by a Virginia flag, don't just pass it by as something you've grown used to, not giving it a glance or a thought. As we navigate this complex time, reflecting on the meaning of 250 years of American democracy, each of us should ask ourselves the two profound questions that the Virginia Seal demands of us. Do we remain committed to rejecting tyranny? Do we possess and practice the virtue necessary to defeat it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Are you going to help me?
It's about 15 minutes or so. Q&A. Please raise your hand. Senator Kaine, happy to
Right here.
answer questions.
Hi, apologies if I'm a little underdressed. My name is Seth Strickler. I'm from Bozak County.
Hey, good to see you.
I was curious about the back side of that seal.
Yes.
Said that we'd never see it again, but I'm asking
Yeah.
you to pull it back up.
Yeah, you bet. I'm glad you did.
Do you have any more information, or can you speak a little
Sure.
bit back on like the design?
Yes.
Design,
Yeah, so with design this as well. Perseverando, you understand what that means, persevering, so we just have to stay at it. That's easy enough. The three female figures represent sort of three branches of science or endeavor. So I did not bring the description with me, but one represents agriculture and one represents industry, and I can't remember what the third does. But so they represent sort of different features of Virginia life. It doesn't seem that enigmatical to me, and I don't even know what that word means that Jefferson used, but nevertheless, that is it. And I really truly had never seen this until I started to write a speech about the seal and the flag of Virginia. Thanks for asking. Who else? Anybody? Yeah, please.
You mentioned two words. One that I couldn't get out of my mind was grievance.
Yes.
And one much earlier, that you're on the health committee.
Yes.
And so about a year and a half ago or so, I gave you a couple of my books. One,
Yes, I remember.
One is Understanding COVID-19, how 500,000 American lives could have been saved. And I'd like to adjust that. Today, in retrospect, I should have said 800,000 or 900,000 American lives could have been saved. Because we neglected to use the science that we had in the medical journals so that we could go and try to create some new medicines that would make some people
Yeah.
live.
Yeah.
So we're still in that same position today that we ignore, for instance, a whole set of drugs called broad-spectrum antiviral
Yeah.
drugs. That there are a dozen drugs that can treat viruses, and when we had COVID-19, we totally ignored those, even though that's in the science.
Yeah.
So we're still in that position.
Yeah.
We're still, we had 3 SARS pandemics,
Right.
or many SARS viruses emerge over 18 years. That means right now, today, we're just due for another one to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, the sad fact is this one, there will be another COVID-19 or another virus. And an interesting thing is the word virus and virtus are very close to one another, and they are both communicable in my view. But I would just say, as a member, I'm on the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, and it's got a broad jurisdiction, but one of the things we're trying to tackle on the committee is the lessons learned and what do we need to do to get better, because you're right, there will be another.
So I've got my 48-page paper that I wrote.
Okay.
At the request of your office.
Yeah.
I'll give you a copy.
Great, give to my staff right here. That would be great. And Rebecca is my education staffer, but she works directly with Samantha, who's my healthcare staffer, and she can take it. Thank you. But yeah, please, right in the front row, and then I see a couple others, please.
So,
And is it Mike?
Mike,
Yeah,
thank you.
Mike.
So one of the questions I have is if Virginia is to worry about tyrants. We've looked at presidents who have increasingly taken executive orders and things
Yep.
along those lines. What is Congress's role, and why
Yeah.
do we continue with Democratic as well as Republican?
I'm so glad you asked. So everybody hear the question, if we're worried about tyrants, what about Congress? And I would say, look, to the extent that I'm worried about tyranny these days, I almost put more of the blame on Congress than I do on executives, because the framers assumed that the executive would overreach. That's all they knew. Our framers knew kings, monarchs, emperors, czars, Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, that's what they knew. they assumed the executive would overreach. And so they built these mechanisms in the Article 1 branch that were designed to check, and the Article 3 branch, designed to check this natural and predictable phenomenon of an executive overreaching. In the war powers one, this is a really interesting one. Madison and Jefferson were writing to one another 10, 15 years after. This was 10 years after the Constitution was done. They were writing about the War Powers Clause, and Madison wrote to Jefferson. Madison, the drafter of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Our Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that it is the executive that is most prone to war and thus most interested in it. It is for this reason that we have placed with studied care the question of war with the legislature. So it was super clear, but what Madison didn't realize was that Congress people frequently lack a backbone, and there's no more difficult vote than a war vote. Even if it works well, you're still going to have death, you're still going to have problems, you're still going to have challenges and consequences you don't foresee. And so long before there were Republicans and Democrats, this was Whigs and Federalists, members of Congress started to delegate the power. Mr. President, just do what you want, and if it goes well, we'll say we were with you all the time, and if not, we'll complain about it. And so on war powers, complete delegation to the executive. Trade is another one, given to Congress in Article 1, but beginning in about the Eisenhower administration, trade has generally been delegated to the president. So this is presidents of both parties and Congresses of both parties. One of my obsessions as a senator is clawing back power. I want a president to occupy every square centimeter of Article 2, but I want a Congress to operate every square centimeter of Article 1. And so I have been forcing votes on the war in Iran and other military actions saying, hey, no war without a vote of Congress. And thus far, I have not been able to convince enough votes across the aisle to join me, but I bring them up about every week in the hopes that one day I'll be persuasive. I also led the charge against presidential imposition of tariffs on the floor of Congress, and we were able to get some crossover support, and eventually the Supreme Court struck down the use of the IEEPA statute to impose tariffs. But Congress has got to take this back, because again, the behavior of the executives in overreaching was predicted. They didn't predict that Congress would chicken out on stuff that we shouldn't. There was one right here. Yes, bow tie.
Thank you. So you mentioned George Wythe is one of the founders that we don't quite give
Yeah.
credit to, and he was overshadowed by people like Jefferson, Madison, Patrick Henry. So this is kind of a twofer.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what the big guns of the American Revolution thought of this motto? And also, can you explain a little bit more about who George Wythe was as a person?
Yes, so on the first question, I don't really know. I don't really know how Sic Semper Tyrannis was perceived, but I do know the way Wythe was viewed. So remember, I told you Wythe left the Declaration of Independence, but he left the Constitutional Convention in Philly, but they left the pride of place of all the Virginians for him to sign. There's a lot of quotes about Wythe when he was at the Philadelphia Convention for the Constitution in 1787. Interestingly enough, he also left that one early because his wife was ill and he needed to go back and tend to his wife. But there's a lot of contemporaneous quotes from people at Philadelphia about how much they valued Wythe as a legal mind. He was one of the first law professors in the country. I mean, he taught law to Patrick Henry, he taught law to Thomas Jefferson, so he was deeply revered as a legal scholar, as a scholar on Latin and Greek translations. He was offered the chance to be on the United States Supreme Court and repeatedly turned it down. He ended up being a judge, like a circuit court judge, basically a trial court judge in Richmond, and handled very, very complex cases. And one of the most complex cases was the trial of someone in his household for murdering him. George Wythe got very ill one day when he was still a practicing judge. And he told friends of his he had been poisoned by a member of his house who he was not related to, but that he'd kind of brought in to his family almost as an adopted son. And in the time period before he died, He changed his will, and he told everybody that this individual had poisoned him. It was one of the most celebrated murder trials in the history of Virginia in the early 1800s, with the legal talent of the day on both sides prosecuting the case and defending this member of the family, and the member was acquitted and then moved out of Virginia and was lost to history. But Wythe was deeply, deeply respected. Not as the flashy one, not as the one that sought attention, not as the one that sought office, but for his intellect and his civic virtue. And he had this tragic ending. There's a wonderful book about the murder trial. I think it's called I Have Been Poisoned, that was written about maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I would recommend to anyone. You really get a sense of who Wythe was in his both legal professorship, but also his active lawyering and judging. So, yeah, please, right here.
Thank you very much for coming out. I had a question, given the nature of the Virginia State motto, thus be always tyrants. I just wanted to get your opinion in reference to that being the pretty blatant tyrannical measure of the redistricting in Virginia. Just kind of your opinion.
Sure, yes. My opinion, if I was lifelong for partisan redistricting, my opinion would not be interesting. My opinion is interesting because I have been a lifelong proponent of nonpartisan redistricting, and I am a sponsor of a federal law, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that would mandate nonpartisan redistricting in federal congressional elections. But the thing that's interesting is I support a yes vote on April 21, and I'll tell you why. President Trump is violating a massive historical precedent by trying to push states to do redistricting mid-decade. So we all know how redistricting happens. You do a census every decade. When the census is done, 2021, 2031, we know what the population is, and so you can then draw districts and have them have a rough numerical equivalence, whether it's the General Assembly or Congress. That's the way we do redistricting. President Trump decided, you know what? If we do it this way, I am likely to lose the House of Representatives. So beginning with North Carolina in 2023, President Trump and the Republicans in North Carolina said, we want to do a mid-decade redistricting to try to steal seats. And they did it, backroom deal. They stole 3 seats, and they're now working on a 4th. You could ask, what does that have to do with Virginia? Let me tell you what it has to do with Virginia. Before I get to what's being done in Texas and other states, just the North Carolina, just those 3 seats, switching those 3 seats from Democrat to Republican enabled Congress last summer to pass the reconciliation bill, the big beautiful bill. That bill cut Medicaid benefits for hundreds of thousands of Virginians. It cut SNAP benefits for hundreds of thousands of low-income people who need food. Has an effect in the neighborhood. I don't know how many followed this story. At the end of December, the Central Hospital in Farmville closed down their labor and delivery ward. Why? They said the cuts that were made in that Medicaid bill were such that they no longer could operate a labor and delivery surgical operation here in Farmville. So now if you're a woman who needs that, you have to drive a whole lot farther to have a baby. So just what North Carolina did has punished Virginia. So then the question is, okay, I've been a long-time supporter of nonpartisan redistricting. I support federal legislation to do it. We've not been able to get any Republicans to join those of us who support it. Do we sit silent while other states take actions that are punishing to the least of these in Virginia, to people who rely on Medicaid, to people who need food benefits? We could sit silent. We could sit silent. But, I mean, I got to say, what does that mean? Does sic semper tyrannis mean if somebody else is taking action that punishes you, you sit silent? In Virginia, we're letting the voters decide that. That's not what happened in North Carolina. That's not what happened in Texas. That's not what's happening in a lot of states. The states that President Trump is pushing to revise are being done in backroom deals without popular referenda. Here, it's up to the voters, and the voters will make the call, and the referendum that is established is for mid-decade. In the event that other states engage in mid-decade redistricting for partisan purposes, we will too. But the Constitution still commands, and it's not being changed, that the redistricting done at the beginning of the decade, once the census is done, is still done by the Nonpartisan Redistricting Commission. So that's that's how I reach the conclusion I reach. I'm going to come over on this side, right back here, yes, and then I'll come right here.
You talked a lot about George Webb and his role on this sealed committee.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, who were some of the other Virginian officials who were involved in that process? Like, who else was working on that committee?
Yep, great question. Let me tell you again who the committee members were. There were 4, and I really only know a lot about 2 of them. I've described, Henry Lee and Robert Carter Nicholas Sr. were both there in Williamsburg, and they were part of this 4-member committee. And again, to do this in 4 days and then submit it and have it be unanimously approved, pretty good work. I don't know a lot about them other than their service on the committee. But the other one was George Mason. Now, Mason played a huge role. I would say, like probably the founder that should get more attention. He was the principal drafter of the Virginia Declaration of Rights that became the basis for the U.S. Bill of Rights. So that was powerful. He played a role in all of these decisions, the election of Henry, the drafting of the Virginia Constitution. And he was part of the committee. And actually, remember I told you that Wythe was in Philly, but then came to Williamsburg to be part of this and was the key drafter. I think Wythe may have felt like he wasn't the most persuasive orator, so he let Mason present the idea to the 5th Convention. It was Mason that presented it. Now, Mason went on to do so many other things. Interestingly enough, here's a Mason fact that I was surprised by. Presidential term limits. This was heavily debated in 1787. And obviously the solution was the president will serve 4-year terms, and there were no term limits included until after FDR had served 4, and then the Constitution was amended, I think it was the 22nd Amendment, to say no more than 2 terms. Mason and Hamilton proposed that the president should be president for life, which was pretty amazing. There were others who proposed that the president have a single 7-year term. What ended up winning out was this 4-year term with no limitation upon terms. Washington set a precedent that was followed by everyone, even though it wasn't legally mandated until FDR ran for a 3rd term at the start of World War II. But Mason played a huge role in many, many decisions. I don't know enough about Lee and Nicholas, so that makes me want to research more for the next time I give this speech. Let me go one. Want to do one more?
Time for one more question.
Okay.
That'll be mine.
That's the inviter's prerogative, but I'm going to come here. Yeah.
So, I think you mentioned this just a little bit in your actual talk, but I wanted to ask, what was the response to this deal and some of the larger business of the Virginia Convention as well among the more loyalist percentage of the population?
Really, a very, very good question. So, given that Virginia had voted for independence in May of 1775, I'm not sure that they invited, like a statistical sample of Virginia to participate in the 5th Virginia Convention, right? So the vote, and again, it was Patrick Henry who made the motion. He had made the famous speech in March of 1775. Now it's May of 1776. He also puts the motion before the body for independence. It's overwhelmingly, it might have been unanimously approved, but if that was the case, that just showed that they hadn't invited everybody, because what the suggestion was, about 30% of those living here were pro-monarchy. Even if they didn't like George III, they were pro-monarchy in some ways. So I'm sure that, and look, the war pretty quickly in 1775, Battle of Great Bridge and other battles early in the Revolutionary War, Virginia was a real field of battle. Remember when Jefferson became governor number 2, he moved the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond to be farther away from potential attack by the English. It turned out that Virginia did not become a big field of battle in the Revolutionary War until the very end with Yorktown. The battles were further to the south, South Carolina, or further to the north, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. So Virginia was not it was a huge battlefield at the beginning, a huge battlefield at the end, but sort of quiet in the middle. So I think that the consensus, it wasn't unanimity, but the consensus was very, very strong in Virginia with these founders like With and others that we're doing the right thing by going our own way. Fantastic questions in the earlier session with students, in the session with students and faculty, in this one. Thanks so much for coming tonight. Happy 250. Thank you. Thanks, John.